Everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining me. My name is Desiree Archer and I'm an Education Program Coordinator with Canadian Geographic Education, the educational committee of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. Can Geo Education is a national program that focuses on strengthening geographic education in K-12 classrooms and increasing public awareness around the importance of geographical literacy. The following video, created with the support of our partner, Husky, is intended to be a tutorial that will guide you through a selection of the many resources that Can Geo Education offers. In special recognition of the month of June, which is National Indigenous Peoples Month, we'll be looking at a variety of Indigenous resources that will help you and your students explore the diversity and history of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Can Geo Education is committed to the journey of reconciliation, sharing Canada's true history, and honoring and supporting Indigenous peoples and their traditions in the development of educational materials. We've been working alongside Indigenous partners from across the country to open up new, inclusive learning opportunities and to deliver programs that focus on rebuilding and revitalizing relationships between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples based on learning, respect, and understanding. The idea for our Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada first originated around Canada 150, when Can Geo felt it was time to look at the history of Indigenous peoples in our country. We're talking the 10, 20, 30,000s of years prior to Canada 150. To achieve this goal, we worked with Indigenous partners from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. These partners played a vital role in factoring in what information was displayed in our Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, which is comprised of 4 volumes: Truth and Reconciliation, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Over 400 contributors worked with Can Geo for our IPAC series and over 200 for our giant floor map. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our giant floor map, stay tuned, it's an incredible resource. In total, roughly 2,000 Indigenous peoples contributed to these projects by the end, and we are so proud of the material we all worked together to create. I would like to take this time to thank all educators and all community members across Canada that made this work possible. Now, let me take you through a few of these programs. Welcome to Canadian Geographic Education's website. You can access this at home at cangeoeducation.ca. We are going to go right into the educational resources that we provide online. So on that left-hand bar here, you see resources, so we'll click that. And as it is National Indigenous History Month, we are going to discuss today about the Indigenous resources that we provide. The first one here is the online version of Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. So again, this is comprised of 4 volumes. We have Truth and Reconciliation, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. You can access this online, however, not all material and information is provided. There is a large amount of information on the website, but if you're interested in having the full set, you can access that or purchase that through amazon.ca or chapters.indigo.ca. If you are looking this up on your website or online, you can go to indigenouspeoplesatlasofcanada.ca. So we're going to take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation volume first. This is comprised of 7 different chapters, from history of residential schools all the way to the road to reconciliation. I'm going to walk you through some of the information that you can find in here. So this is the history of residential schools, and it discussed the residential schools in detail, how they operated in Canada for more than 160 years with upwards of 150,000 children passing through. These children were removed from their families from the church and hoped to assimilate them and rip them from their cultural roots. Here you'll find an in-depth description of the events that occurred, and you'll also see a map depicting where residential schools existed in Canada. This is a very significant visual aid. We also provide this information on our giant floor map. So it's really nice to read through this with your family, with your students, and really educate ourselves more on what happened during this time when residential schools operated. I'd also like to bring your attention to the road to reconciliation. So here it talks about how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008 to document the experiences of residential school survivors. So in this chapter, there's background information and highlights of where reconciliation has been and where we are going. So there are first-hand stories in these volumes of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis groups. It also looks at TRC in the community. So this map here is from 2009 to 2011. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada took part in more than 400 outreach and statement gathering initiatives. So this map illustrates the communities that were visited during that time period. Now we're going to have a look at the other volumes. We're going to start with our First Nations volume. Go back to the top here, I apologize. So in this volume, there are 30 different chapters. They range from wildlife, climate, protected areas, all the way to racism, treaties, natural environment, and food. We're gonna have a look at what is Indigenous. So this is written by Drew Hayden Taylor. So Drew grew up and still lives on the Curve Lake First Nation, Ojibwe, in central Ontario. So in this chapter, What is Indigenous? It discusses cultural appropriation. So he gives example of what you might consider as good cultural appropriation, like enjoying ethnical food, or examples of bad cultural appropriation, such as writing a story with a unique cultural perspective without permission. Now, I would love to suggest that this chapter would be a great resource to use in the classroom or at home to generate a discussion on what it is cultural appropriation and how to acknowledge tradition in a respectful way. We'll go back here and have a look at our residential schools chapter. Now, on our website, you'll find a lot of information and activities around residential schools, and I will highlight a few of these resources later. Now, this chapter was written by Anne Spice. Her family experienced life in residential schools. Her grandfather went to Carcross Residential School in the Yukon for 4 years between 1936 and 1940. In 2015, the TRC archives brought up records stating the school had bad reputation for poor health, harsh discipline, and poor food, and discusses how this is a very confrontational archive data to be faced with and to read, and the emotion of knowing your family members experience this is quite devastating. So another great resource to talk about, use these stories to learn from our mistakes, to educate ourselves on the history and what actually did happen in these residential schools. Go back and look at our next volume. So we're going to take a look at the Inuit volume. This one here has 26 different chapters, again ranging in a number of different topics. We have got climate change, Nunavut, urban Inuit, performing arts, place names, wildlife. We are going to have a quick look at the wildlife chapter. So this one here discusses key species up north that Inuit groups rely on for food. So we have Arctic char, we have beluga, we talk about the narwhal. There are several different species listed here. It talks about their significance and importance to the food sources in Inuit communities. Now, if I were to use this resource at home or with younger students, I would really consider doing a photo essay here. So either providing your students with the photos, asking them to research depending on the age group, and have them highlight key components unique to that animal, how it plays a role in Inuit communities, and how they are an important food source. All right, we're gonna go ahead and have a look at our final volume, which is the Métis volume. This one here has 28 different chapters, again covering a wide variety of content, from activism, modern political life, worldview, veterans. We're gonna have a look at languages right now. Now, the Métis are primarily known for speaking Michif, the official language of the Métis Nation. However, they also speak other languages, including French Michif, which is a dialect of Canadian French with some Algonquian linguistic features. So this chapter discusses the history behind Michif. It also provides you with an English and Michif language activity. So it translates common terms into the Michif language. This is a fun activity to try at home. If you do have trouble with pronunciation, using an online resource will help there. All right, we're gonna have a look at one last chapter. This will be the frequently asked questions. This is a great starting point, especially if you're working with younger kids, really building on this foundation, ensuring that we have a good foundation of knowledge to build on. The content in these atlases does get complex. It is difficult to understand, especially if you are a younger student. So really ensuring that we have the right building blocks to learn more is very important here. So here we have general questions such as who are the Métis, what is the Métis Nation, what is the Métis population in Canada, and so forth. So again, if you'd like to start here and work your way backwards through the atlases, there's no right way, wrong way to go through it. It's really building on your knowledge, doing more research, asking the questions. We're back on this Indigenous educational resource page. We've just gone over the different volumes and chapters that are included in the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. And now I'm going to introduce you to the teacher's guide that goes along with this. So this includes lesson plans and activities that teachers and parents can use to examine the chapters of the atlases in more detail. So click that there. I'd like to bring your attention to the logo. I challenge you to see if you can differentiate the different symbols that are embedded in there. It's a very powerful logo, and I think it is super important to acknowledge the fact that it is compiled of very unique and significant Indigenous symbols. A quick overview of what's available in this teacher's guide. This is accessible to everyone, easy to read, easy to use. So for parents and guardians that are at home watching this, you can use this with your family and young ones. So it's separated into your introduction volume, your First Nations volume, Métis, and Inuit volume. And just to give you a quick view of what these lesson plans look like. So for the introduction volume, so we present you with an activity idea. We've highlighted here the pages that correlate with what we're suggesting you do. And then we present you with some discussion questions. So this is to get the ball rolling to start a conversation about the topic. And then we have some more summary activities. So we generate some ideas for you. You can modify these as necessary. And then if you were to scroll down further on the page, you will see lesson plans like this. So we've got the geography of a lacrosse stick. If I was teaching lacrosse in gym class right now, that's even more relevant to my students. So making those connections where possible, I think, is super fantastic. So we have the lesson implementation, we have your learning objectives, so hopefully these will correlate nicely with your curriculum expectations. We presented you with your minds on, we then go for your hands-on, your questions to summarize, and then extending your geographical thinking. So how can you take this lesson further, and how can this apply outside of the classroom? Go back to the Canadian Geographic Education website and scroll down to this IPAC giant floor map tab. So again, IPAC means Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. And this is the map here. What it is an 11 by 8 meter vinyl floor map. So this fits perfectly in a school gym. It comes in a hockey bag. It's about 100 pounds when you order it. Ropes and pylons for activities are included, as well as a teacher's guide and lesson plans and cards for students to hold. Now I'll bring up the map here just to give you a quick overview of what it looks like. So along the sides, we have a timeline. So this covers significant events for Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis groups. Now, not all significant events are listed, but a good number are there. The map is color coordinated. So these colors represent the different Indigenous family groups for language that exist through Canada. And a great way to introduce the other aspects that you see on this map is to play a game of Simon Says. So as you see, there's a legend in this bottom left corner, but if you have 50 or 60 students working on this map at one time, it is nearly impossible to have them all around that legend. So as a teacher, you plan a game of Simon Says, you go over your directions depending on the age group, you can challenge students to see if they know the different oceans, encourage students to find the different provinces. So something unique about this map is there are no colonial lines. There are treaty lines, but students will have to really draw on their prior knowledge to distinguish between different provinces here. If you scroll down, you'll see the number of different lesson plans that we've developed. Now, I'd like to point out that these are great standalone lesson plans. You don't need to necessarily have the giant floor map to maximize this resource. I'm going to take you over the residential schools lesson plans right now, and I'd like to highlight that there is a warning here. So it says this activity deals with sensitive topics. Please review the following activity and accommodate accordingly. I find this especially true when working with older students, as conversations do become more in depth. You cover more content, and just giving students the opportunity to really indulge and understand what has happened can become an emotional conversation, difficult conversation. So just being mindful and reading your students and scaffolding, making sure they're asking the right questions and that you are prepared to answer those. Now, this pre-activity is great for those of us that are at home right now. It gives you an idea of how to discuss residential schools while also highlighting some resources here. So I will go over some Google Earth Voyager stories in a bit, so this one here, and really show you what that looks like. And again, I will tie it back to this, but keep that in mind because it's a wonderful resource to use for all ages at home. So we've got learning outcomes. So for teachers that are watching this at home, these fit in nicely with our curriculum expectations. And then we have the different Indigenous groups, so First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So we discuss their relationship and connections to residential schools and how they were affected. And then I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom to show you and highlight how we've differentiated our lesson plans according to different age groups. So we've got elementary here, intermediate, and secondary school grades. So again, modify this as necessary. If you have a stronger elementary group, say grade 6, but you see something nice in the grade 7, definitely use that, just modify accordingly. So I'm going to click the introduction here. So this is a great resource for teachers. It highlights learning outcomes so you can cross-reference those with your curriculum expectations. It also introduces ways to introduce the map to your students. Now, there are lots of different components and aspects that have been added on this map. It's very detailed. So what we've done here is we've described and highlighted all of these different aspects to ensure that teachers are familiar with what each symbol means. So different reserves, what is a reserve parcel. So ensuring that we are setting everyone up for success here. All right, so we're back on Canadian Geographic Education website, and we're on the giant floor maps page. I just want to highlight the other giant floor maps that we've created and other resources that are available to you. So we have Canada from Space, Drawn to Victory, so this covers World War I. We've got energy production and transmission, so learning Canada's energy story, mapping democracy, Ontario parks, unfortunately that's only available to Ontario teachers, polar knowledge, so discussing the Arctic circumpolar region, relocation, Vimy Ridge. We do have a couple at the bottom here. These are available only upon special requests, but super relevant. And again, check out the lesson plans that are available here because they are standalone and you don't necessarily need the giant floor map to use these. I will now introduce you to our tiled maps. So again, these are printout versions of the giant floor maps. I'm going to bring up the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada just to give you a look at what it looks like. So if you zoom in here, you'll see that these pages have been printed. Now, I definitely suggest, for sustainable reasons, to laminate those if you plan on using it more than once. It's a great resource to have, and it's not age specific. I think this is great for PD, for teachers, leadership, and teamwork, team building activities. Mapping activities are endless. We are going to go back now to our resource page and have a look at the other resources that Canadian Geographic has created with a specific emphasis on Indigenous education. So I'm just going to highlight the bottom here. So these are all articles that have been written for Canadian Geographic. So these are great resources for learning or reading comprehension with any grade, tying those into a research project. Maybe you just leave them on their desk in the morning, silent reading. I'd also like to highlight the National Film Board of Canada, so films related to Indigenous issues. This is a free resource. There's a search bar, there's an education tab, there's endless content, not necessarily specific only to Indigenous education, but there is countless videos there. So definitely recommend taking the time to have a look at that. Now we're going to explore Canada's residential schools in the Google Earth Voyager stories. This is an incredible resource appropriate for any age, and this is what I was speaking to when I was going over the residential school lesson plan. So we have loaded Canada's residential schools. I'd like to point out that I'm using Chrome, as Safari doesn't always work with Google Earth, and I don't want anyone to get discouraged if they're using that browser and having troubles loading. So Canada's residential schools, there are 4 topics here. We can explore the background and history, inside a residential school, effects of the system, and moving forward. Today I'm going to give you a little insight of inside a residential school. So this story takes students all around Canada to different locations. However, it's important to note that not all residential schools are listed on this map. I will show you how to zoom out and see the ones that are, but for the time being, I will just go through a couple of the stories with you. So we have schools relied heavily on unpaid child labor. So that's the first section here. We're at Blue Quills Indian Residential School. Next, we're going to talk about the first day of school at Pine Creek School. And then we're going to move to a different location. So this is haircut. So this was the church's way to assimilate students. So the Lebret Residential School, they will talk a bit about that in this section. Next, we're going to reduce to a number. So Pelican Lake Indian Residential School. So it says here we walked with the numbers on us. So names were stripped from students and they were only recognized as a number. So it's a great way to generate discussions with students. Also exploring the different landscapes of Canada's regions is very useful. We've got Voiceless from St. Anne's Indian Residential School in Fort Albany, Ontario. So students were forbidden from using their own language and had to communicate either in English or French. So again, talking about assimilation and the trauma that these children had to go through while living and going to school in these residential schools. Suppressing culture, the main overarching topic in residential schools. So Kamloops Residential School in BC. So here you can see that they're on the coast. So really you can give students a link to this, have some scaffolding questions, ask them not only to discuss maybe how they're feeling about what they're reading, but also look at the landscapes. And finally, enduring trauma. So this is from Fort Alexander Residential School in Manitoba. So using these arrows here, you can widen your view of the landscape. I'm just going to show how I mentioned earlier that you can see the different residential schools that existed in Canada. So the further you zoom out, they start popping up. So this is a great visual for students, for everyone really, to see the spread of residential schools in the country, but also identify where they are more populated, what regions of Canada, and why that might be. So asking students, why is there more residential schools found in the West Coast rather than the East Coast? And why were there fewer up north? So really using this resource to generate a conversation and get students thinking about all of these factors. The final resource I'd like to introduce to you today is Canadian Geographic Education's online classroom. So you can access this at onlineclassroom.cangeoeducation.ca. So we have categorized lesson plans from kindergarten to grade 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, 10 to 12, and then we have this K to Gray. This is a page with links that throw to outside resources and initiatives that we are very proud to work with. As I've mentioned previously, June is National Indigenous History Month. So every day this month, we are releasing new content and lesson plans focusing on Indigenous education. And we have created a very extensive portfolio of resources. We are very grateful to have live readings for the last 2 weeks on Siatu Skin. He is an 11-year-old Nakota boy. So there have been 7 readings, 8 in total, highlighting different aspects of Indigenous culture. So as you can see, we have highlighted day and activities, and links for everything can be found under those red bolded titles. And we do have an introduction here from Sky Bridge, so the Chief Operating Officer at APTN. So he welcomes us to the month of June with a very inspirational hello. So I highly recommend everyone checking out and seeing what he has to say. So this is an example of the readings that have been provided for Can Geo Education. And we also do advertise our YouTube page, so with live talks. We have released our Kids SIP right now, so Ultimate Animals for Kids digital download. So there's activities in there, tons of facts. So that's accessible. We've got Energy IQ, so learning about energy production and transmission in Canada, Canada's energy story. So you can download that all here. And then we also do have educational programs that have previously been featured. So in previous months, the Anthropocene education program. So we have now scientists have declared this epoch as the Anthropocene. So we were previously in the Holocene. We're currently in the Anthropocene. And what that means is that we are now having a look at the human impact we are having on the world. So great resource here. We've got the relocation program, Energy IQ, again, Canada's energy story, unmasking influenza, so talking about pandemics and the Spanish flu, and 10,000 changes. So in 10,000 changes, we talk about reducing our plastic usage. If you keep scrolling down to the bottom of this page, you can access all the lesson plans that have previously been featured this month on the online classroom. So again, these are primarily Indigenous resources. However, it was World Ocean Day on June 8th. So we do have a few additional resources that coincide with that day. So these are great resources to use at home. We have the house story here, where students, the intention is to read the story and then mix and match worksheet. So there's analogies throughout the story, and we want them to match those. So it's very simple, just minds on activity, firing those neurons, and really having students think about how this relates to perhaps their life and what all of these analogies actually refer to. I would love to encourage all of you to become a member. So if you scroll to the bottom of our online classroom homepage, you will see our membership form. So we'd love for you to stay informed. You can sign up here, whether you're a teacher, a parent, a youth. We have over 25,000 members across Canada, and we'd love to have you aboard. Please share this video and these resources with your network so that all Canadians can better understand Indigenous peoples, celebrate National Indigenous Peoples Month, and take a critical first step on the path to reconciliation. I'd like to thank you so much for your time today, and I will see you soon.